Did you notice that a couple of the acolytes lit our candles this morning? This is something new we're going to try. I know you've done it in the past, but we're going to try it during Lent and see how it works out. But I guess you are tall enough. We solved that problem, right? So there's this little boy. He found the big old family Bible one day. He opened it with fascination. He was looking at all the old pages, as he turned them, and suddenly something fell out of this Bible. He picked it up. He looked at it very closely, and it turns out it was an old leaf from a tree that had been pressed in between the pages. It was a leaf. "Mama, look what I found," the boy called out. "What have you got there, dear?" his mother asked. With astonishment in the young boy's voice, he answered, "I think it's Adam's suit." Bad joke. But I love the Adam and Eve story. I mean, it really is one of the more creative stories in the entire Bible. And I like to play around with it quite a bit and think about it. In the first couple of chapters in the book of Genesis, you may know there are actually two different creation stories. And it is the second creation story that really features these two characters we know as Adam and Eve. Now, something you need to know about Adam and Eve before I continue, because it helps in trying to interpret these stories. The word Adam, or Adam, the way it would be pronounced in the Hebrew, is the word for man or mankind, to be inclusive about it, or humankind. And the word Eve is related to a Hebrew word for living, so we tend to think of Eve meaning the mother of all living. And by the way, Adam is of course closely related to the word Adama, which is the Hebrew word for ground. This is a word play that underscores the very close relationship between human beings and the earth or the soil. As Genesis 2:7 says, "Then the Lord God formed Adam from the Adama," formed man from the ground, "and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life," the ruach of life, "and the man became a living being." So it only took two ingredients, dirt and air, and there you got a person. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate about whether the creation stories or the Adam and Eve story in particular is a literal historical event. Just know it was not written to be history. It's not a history story. The stories were written for two reasons. One, to be theology. It really is a theological work, namely God's role in creation. That's theology. No matter how or when it happened, that's what Genesis is telling us. So it's theology first. It's also anthropology. The anthropology is the study of humanity. Our origins and everything about us is anthropology. And I'm particularly interested in the anthropology that comes out of the early part of the book of Genesis. Three things I want to bring up if you're taking notes here. Number one, we are made in the image of God. That's the first. That's the first point. Now, this is where theology and anthropology meet, right? We are made in the image of God. In Genesis 1:26, it begins by saying, God says, "Let us make Adam," humankind, "in our image, according to our likeness." So number one, we're made in God's image. Number two, the anthropological point here, is that human beings, this is the second half of that verse 26, human beings are given dominion over all the animals. Dominion over all the animals. Now, this is not a license to kill and use up all the resources. The word dominion here is related to the word stewardship, or that concept. So what he's really saying is that we, by being given dominion over the world, nature, we are to care for the animals in nature, because we're really the only species that has that ability to actually be a caretaker of that. Now, number three, third anthropological point, as I've already noted, we are made from the ground. We are made from the ground, Adama. Scientifically, it's interesting to me that the truth is we are made out of the same stuff as everything else on this planet. And in fact, now they tell us that we originate from stardust, so it even goes further than that. But the stars collide and they break up and they come and Earths or, planets are formed and all that. Now we're part of that. So we originally came from stardust, but we're all from the same place. Now there are other points of anthropology, the science of humanity in the book of Genesis and the Bible as a whole, but today I want to make a point that I never hear made anywhere else. This is totally my theory, so you can take it or leave it. It's this. Adam and Eve, that is the children of the ground, that's what that means, became human when their eyes were opened. They became human when their eyes were opened. Then the eyes of both were opened, says the writer, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. It is here, I'm saying, that humanity was born. That's what this story represents. And likewise, I want to say today that you and I become more human when our eyes are opened as well. We'll get into what that means. But this is my theme for Lent, opening our eyes. I'm calling the overall theme of this season, Lent, an eye-opening experience. And all the stories we're going to look at through Lent will relate to someone opening their eyes to something. I thought about calling it an eye-popping experience, but that just sounded gross, so I decided to go with eye-opening. Now, I have to say, one of my inspirations for this series is the ordeal that Glenn Gordis over here had to go through in recent weeks and months with his detached retina. Glenn had to endure 3 different procedures to get it right. Each one was a little more difficult than the previous one. But going through that, you really inspired me, Glenn, with your willingness and determination to go through those procedures. And always followed by 2 weeks of keeping his head down. So in Glenn Gordis fashion, we are going to journey through the season of Lent, not only with our heads down in a posture of prayer, but with our heads up, opening our eyes. So let's look briefly at the Adam and Eve story and how they opened their eyes and what that might mean for you and me. Now recall that I said there are 2 creation stories. And in the first creation story, Adam is created after everything else has been created. There's no Eve in the first one. But man, humankind, was created after everything else. But in the second creation story, which begins in chapter 2, verse 4, Adam is created before everything else is created, except for a garden. Now, I know stuff like that will drive a biblical literalist crazy. What is the truth here? But again, we're not talking history. We're talking theology and anthropology. But the Garden of Eden makes its first appearance in the second creation story. And in this garden, God plants trees that are edible, and 2 other trees, however, that are not exactly trees that you can go down and buy from the local nursery, namely the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And after describing the rivers that help to water these trees in the garden, God gives Adam his first job. Now, Adam did not have a high school or college education, and there were limited job opportunities in that day. But God found a job for him as the gardener in the Garden of Eden. Great job, good paying job. The hours were good. The climate was so good he could do it in the birthday suit, and the food was free. But there was one caveat. Adam could eat all he wanted from any of the trees in the garden, maybe even from the tree of life, which sounds sort of yummy, but he couldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, why not? Wouldn't God want Adam to know the difference between good and evil? Surely. Well, remember this. This is the second creation story. Adam is created first. And knowledge of good and evil is not all that important if you're the only living creature on the face of the planet. Who cares, right? Now, regardless of God's motive for denying Adam the fruit of that particular tree, God decides that Adam seems to be a little bit lonely. So God decides to make some companions for Adam. First, the animals. And that was okay up to a point. But then God decided, well, let's just create somebody sort of like you. So he takes one of his ribs. I told you it was a very creative story. And he makes Eve the mother of all living. And then there's that nudity thing. What's that all about? I know some of you are here today just because I put on Facebook that I was going to talk about why Adam and Eve were nude. What's that about? Well, think about it. Adam is created first, as I said, and is only around a bunch of trees. There's no need for privacy and modesty. No need. Then the animals are created as well, and animals don't wear clothing, do they? With the exception of dog sweaters at Christmas time, I understand that, but animals generally do not wear clothing. And so when Eve comes along, a tradition of nudity has already been established. As verse 25 says, and the man and his wife, now I don't know, they didn't have benefit of clergy, I don't know how they got married, but the man and his wife were both naked and they were not ashamed. Why would they be ashamed? Every other creature is naked. There's no need for that. Well, then the serpent, who is also naked, comes along and tempts Eve to eat the forbidden fruit by pointing out that if she eats this fruit, she will become as wise as her husband's boss, God, the creator of the Garden of Eden. And this sounds so good to her that she takes some of this fruit, not necessarily an apple, just a fruit, and shares it with Adam. Picture a bride and groom at the wedding reception stuffing cake in one another's mouths. That's what's happening here, I think. So what happens then? Then, as they're eating the fruit, the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Now, I know I'm being a little facetious here, but first, I don't know where they got the sewing machine to do that. And second, I don't know how you make a loincloth out of a bunch of fig leaves, but I admit that I'm not an expert on such things. All kidding aside, the reason I am claiming that this is the moment they became Homo sapiens, the human species, is because up until this moment, they were just like all the other animals in their lack of clothing, which, to me, is symbolic of their wildness. Their lack of clothing is symbolic of their wildness. And so when the writer says, the eyes of both were open, this means that in their wild-like animal state, they had lacked the knowledge of good and evil, just as animals today, even the domestic ones, do not have a highly developed sense of right and wrong, if they have one at all. Now, I know there's some debate about that, and when a dog or a cat or another domestic animal might feel a little guilty about something. But they don't have it like we have it, or we should have it. Now, if you enjoy visiting nudist colonies, anybody want to fess up? You might think, man, this story is hopelessly old-fashioned. It's all about them being naked. No, that's not really what the story's about. You miss the finer point when you focus on their nudity. The point of the story is that we become more human when our eyes are open. That is, when we develop a moral compass, when we eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This makes us more human. And this story, then, is a tone setter for the rest of the Bible. It is screaming to us, even if in subtle, clever ways, to open our eyes to the great moral questions of life, to be more self-aware, to be more reflective about evil in our world, to be more cognizant of the plight of those who are suffering from evil, and to be more awake to our responsibilities and duties to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So here's the irony of this story. I'm sure you haven't missed it, because you're probably sitting there going, wait a minute, something doesn't sound right. The irony is that this story is suggesting that the first sin eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was the birth of humanity. Now, years ago, I taught an ethics class in a small college in Texas for several semesters, and each semester I would tell my students on the first day that they were about to commit the first sin. Because studying ethics, when you think about it, really is eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this actually frightened some of my more religious students, and I had to calm them down, talk them off the cliff, and help them realize, no, we're not doing anything bad. I noted a few weeks ago that in terms of ethics and morality, we are a work in progress. Well, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is the story about the beginning of that work. And so as we begin our journey through the season of Lent, let us open our eyes even wider to the great moral and ethical dilemmas of our day. And when we wake up each morning, let's put on more than our clothing. Yeah, go ahead and do that. We don't want to see that. Put on more than your clothing, but more importantly, put on your humanity. Amen.